Welcome to this edition of Thought to Action, presented by the Herb London Center for Policy Research. I'm Chris Cordani, your host. This is our first one
for 2022.
If you enjoy our content, don't forget to hit that like button. Also, comment, share, and subscribe. To enjoy sneak previews of our videos, exclusive content, and more special programming in the works, join our Patreon page, patreon.com/thought-to-action. As a subscriber, you'll also have access to our Ask Us Anything sessions, where we at the London Center answer your questions. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Getter, and our website, londoncenter.org. We're going to take a look back at 2021 and a look ahead to 2022 with our panel from the London Center: President, Lieutenant Colonel retired Tony Shaffer, Senior Fellow Lieutenant Colonel retired British Army Tim Wilson, Distinguished Fellow Bryan Griffin, and Senior Fellow Jay Homnick. Vladimir Putin has left us with a situation that continues to escalate in Ukraine and the Crimea section. Let's talk about that. Tony, you've been on the air many times, and you've been asked this question: will Putin invade Ukraine?
Yeah, he is. It's kind of like people who are not paying attention don't understand. There's a constant effort by Putin that he stated he would do years ago. I always find it ironic when people refer back to the Obama administration and the debate that Mitt Romney had, and he talked about Russia being a threat, and Barack Obama dismissed it. And those of us who actually study it recognize that Putin is very patient, very strategic, and he's never given up on his goal of reestablishing a Russian empire that is as extensive and as essentially militarily aligned as the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. He's never deviated from that. So at this point, they've taken parts, they effectively control parts of Ukraine. At this point, I don't believe he doesn't have to. He's not going to invade all of Ukraine, but he will invade. There will be incursions which increase his influence and continue the reduction, if you will, the military reduction of Ukraine. And it's going to be interesting to see how NATO responds, because I don't think it will, versus some of our NATO allies like Poland who will. And that's the issue: is how do we measure the U.S. interests against the Biden lack of interest, and what will happen? So I'll end it by saying one more thing. One of our senior fellows who's not here, board members, Ambassador Hank Cooper, reminded me that he was involved in the disarmament of Ukraine back in the 90s. And we made commitments to the Ukrainians that if they gave up their nuclear weapons, that we would be there to support defending them against aggression from Russia. I don't think it's going to happen. And it's not because we didn't sign up to it or wasn't the right thing to do. It's because the Biden administration has no understanding of strategy, and their interests are essentially to cave at every opportunity. So I'm sorry, go ahead, Tim.
No, that's all right. I totally agree with what you're saying. I just find it interesting that they don't even seem to recognize that merely by exercising his troops on the border with Ukraine, Vladimir has already gained very public phone calls with Biden, a huge amount of debate about what's going on, and a lot of internal publicity as well, showing what a strong man he is. And I agree. I don't think he'll invade and take over the whole of Ukraine. He's going to nibble away at it. And he has already, you're right, he's already invaded in a number of ways. He took over the Crimea, and he now has, we believe, in the order of 10,000 Spetsnaz-type troops wandering around the rest of Ukraine. And this despite, as you rightly say, Tony, the hugely strong guarantees that we gave Ukraine only in the 1990s about if they gave up the many, many thousands of nuclear weapons that the Soviet Union had left there into our care, we would look after them. They gave them up. We're now effectively reneging, and once again, this is America not standing by its word.
I think it's important to recognize that the whole system of American treaties has really been undermined by the difference between the infighting between the parties It used to be that when you signed a treaty with America, that was a treaty for both parties. Today, it's not really like that. You sign a treaty, it's only for the president that's there for those 4 years. And the rest of the world can't really proceed based on that lack of certainty and certitude. It's a desperate situation. But I'd like to also make a projection here into what I think Putin and China are doing, because they are speaking to each other. Now, traditionally, they have disputes, but they seem to have set their disputes aside to realize that America is at a weak moment and that they can both benefit from challenging America at its weakest moment. So what I could see happening is that Putin takes a piece of the Ukraine, even if it's a smaller piece. But if the Biden administration shows its weakness, then China makes its move on Taiwan. And then Putin can even come back and take a second piece of Ukraine if he wants after that. But the point is, if they basically demonstrate America's weakness to the world and to America itself, weakness feeds off itself, just like strength feeds off itself. If you just keep making the weak decisions, one leads into the other. So it is a very, very dangerous turning point.
So to follow up on both points, China has now invested in establishing a core level element that is essentially their equivalent of Marines. Those elements are now developed, they're trained, and the only reason that they've focused it so effectively is the idea of conducting an invasion of some sort. So I agree with what Jay's saying. I think that, because I get this question all the time, are China and Russia coordinating? It's like, no, they're watching what each does for purposes of understanding what the other can get away with if they so choose. And I think that's where we're at right now. Yeah. Putin is going to continue to be aggressive. Xi is going to figure out how to be aggressive or take some more terrain for the purposes of what China wants to do. And they're going to continue to be very effective in slowly gobbling up and gaining military influence over the regions of interest that they've already said they want.
One question worth answering here in this conversation, and it might be one that our viewers are wondering, is why? Why do people in countries like Russia and China, Putin and Xi, act in this way? And there's a lot of similarities, but I think largely it comes down to the way that leaders of socialist and communist countries have to act because they can produce no other success because of their style of government. Communist and socialist countries in the modern world will not be able to flourish. They will not be able to provide better standards of living for their people or compete on an economic scale with free markets and free countries. So they have to come up with other false wins. And the way that they've both figured to do this for their people is to stir the nationalist spirit and try to get people to be distracted from the basically oppressed, impoverished lifestyles that socialism and communism produce, and take small wins in border expansions and territorial disputes. It's a way of population control, essentially. It is a method of population control to distract people from failed systems of government that China and Russia both have. And ultimately, I think that's why we see both of these countries and both of these leaders acting in this way, and we should call it out for what it is.
Absolutely right. I mean, amongst other things, one looks at China economically, and the GDP per person, there are still many, many millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of very poor peasants out in the countryside acting as effectively slaves to the regime. What is going on? Well, China is mighty. If you take a few cents off 1.5 billion people, you end up with quite a lot of money. That is what the regime then wields. It doesn't wield it to improve the lot of their people. And interestingly, the same thing applies in Russia, where people who lived under the communist regime are now hankering, in some cases, openly and publicly, to say, I wish we were back under the days of the communists. Why is that? because at least they had some certainty about what was going on. That certainty might well be that they had to queue for 4 or 5 hours just to get a cabbage, but at least they knew that if they queued, they'd get a cabbage, as opposed to what is going on now. Let's put it like this: capitalism has not been a great success in Russia because it's a kleptocracy. And yeah, there are a lot of wealthy Russian billionaires now. But again, the people out in the countryside are struggling.
So to that point, it's that struggle. The foundation for that struggle was the Soviet system, was a communist system which has never fully reformed itself. And I would argue it's not going to, based on the kleptocracy you just mentioned, Tim. But I think it's important to recognize, no matter what their beliefs are, our beliefs have to be the ones we focus on. Because let's face it, there's two common features of Marxist systems. First and foremost is death. That system can only sustain itself by aggression. And we know Russia, Stalin had purges. Millions of people were killed or used as slave labor. The great in China, when China became communist, Mao eliminated the population. Pol Pot, the Nazis, which are by all standards that I'm aware of academically, they are socialists. Were another form of Marxism. It was just nationalism. Yeah, it was theirs was based on race. The Soviets was based on economics, and that's the thing. They can't guarantee improving people's lives. The only thing they can do is reduce everybody to the lowest common denominator. That includes the Nazis. This economic miracle that Hitler gets credit for, it was a complete sham. They were taking money. Their banks were playing games, essentially stealing everybody's money for purposes of investment. There was no economic miracle. So it's one of those situations where I think we owe the American public an education on why, as Bryan said, this is why they're doing it. Their political systems cannot self-sustain. They cannot grow. They must reduce their population and gain access to resources for their version of governance to continue. And that's why they're doing what they're doing.
And distract their masses.
Before we move forward, gentlemen, I want to get back to the idea that Vladimir Putin is trying to, or at least the assumption that Vladimir Putin is trying to reform a sort of the USSR. What happens with not only their other former Soviet republics, a couple of them with some rather eccentric dictators? I mean, I don't really see Ramon of Tajikistan or the Birdman of Turkmenistan giving up power anytime in the near future. And would Vladimir Putin continue trying to push or perhaps force his influence into some of the old Iron Curtain countries?
He has a lot of influence there already, and basically he's propping up a number of those dictators. So they're nothing but puppet regimes where, if you like, those leaders you mentioned are Vladimir's puppets. The Emperor Vlad is pushing wherever he can. And Bryan nailed the most important point of the lot. These aggressive moves against the West, as it were, and the former satellites are all about distracting his own public from their own misery brought about by his failed socialist policies.
Yeah, to continue Tim's point, there are a lot of, and by the way, they helped us. There was Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, what is the other stand? Kyrgyzstan? Turkmenistan. Kyrgyzstan, no, it's a joke. And they were essentially used as bases during our incursion into Afghanistan. We had a lot of support because the Russians said, do it. I mean, they was like, yeah, go help the Americans. And the same thing stands true. So a lot of the stands, I think, will remain kind of under the heavy influence because they economically and politically want to do that. With that said, Eastern Europe does not want that. And that's where we need to understand that there's a role for us as the Americans and NATO to play. Poland is one of the strongest republics that we should be working with. They love us. We should love them. They stand for all the same principles we have held up. And they were one of our biggest supporters behind the scenes in the Cold War. So I think we owe it to them, because they are a NATO nation, and others who have really wanted to embrace Western democratic concepts, small d, not big D concepts. And that should be our focus, is what are our principles and how can we help others live up to their principles? And that's what Putin's trying to interfere with. That's why the Russians do interfere with elections. It's one of those things that the left is getting wrong for their own purposes. Did the Russians interfere with 2016 elections? No doubt they did. But they didn't have access to Trump. They were just trying to upend everything. That was their interest, to disrupt. They're doing the same thing in Europe. Every time there's an election, they do everything they can to disrupt it, because it's in their interest to create the chaos to maintain instability in those countries. That's part of their continued national security strategy. So the way to counter that is by us embracing the republics and those former members of the Warsaw Pact who want to be independent. That should be our interest. So the stands can do whatever the hell they want. They will. But I think these other nations who have chosen to go a different way need to be supported so they can maintain that. So,
well, for a little comic relief, and if you remember the movie The Hot Rock in the early 70s, so the way they robbed the bank was they hypnotized the guy in charge of the safety deposit box. And then later they were able to go in and get him to open the boxes for them. But the trigger word where the hypnosis kicks in was Afghanistan, Bananistan. So those jokes have been around for a long time.
I think Putin is smoking banana peels, just saying.
Oh, maybe he just likes them. At least he's not delving into the opium. So, well, maybe.
It's interesting, though. I mean, he's cunning like a fox. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline is going to cause a lot of future problems because it's a major source of energy supply to a number of nations, in particular Germany, Germany is at the center of the European Union. And for them to now depend for their heating and electricity on continuing and continuous Russian supply, that's a damn foolish strategic move.
Yeah, because everything's not going to be physical warfare in terms of amassing influence. And we better start getting a lot smarter about the ways that these countries are amassing other forms of influence. You know, Africa has become a battleground of Chinese leverage production.
Right.
And then back to the original question, you know, would Putin take a window of X, Y, or Z if he saw it? Absolutely. And destable countries allow for a Russia or a China to fund a candidate that they can control to take leadership.
Yep. I think that's the thing, Brian. The Chinese have used, as we know, we studied this, we know it's soft power to increase their influence by essentially buying politicians, giving politicians resources, and thereby establishing a very strong foothold and control of resources in Africa. That's in their interest to do it. And we've had very little in the way of an effective strategy to counter that. And arguably, again, we should be leading with our principles, the idea of trying to support democracies and republics and keeping them free. And we have not had an effective strategy to do that. As a matter of fact, I would argue that we have helped embrace and fund George Soros, and his Open Societies project, which actually works to do the opposite. Anywhere they show up, they actually empower the government elements to become essentially fascists and basically suppressing free speech and free ideas. It's something we have not effectively dealt with.
And there's no clarity on the world stage. I mean, the UN has completely forsaken any ability to make distinctions between the power and progress of a free society versus the oppression and hopelessness of an autocratic society or a communist country. And if the entire world and all of the world institutions that everyone gives so much credence to is focused on things like climate change, then they are missing the biggest threat to humanity that the 20th century has by and far proven, which is big government. It's killed more people and posed a bigger problem.
Absolutely right, Brian. But most people do not realize that the United Nations has always had a majority of, shall we say, of dictatorships playing in it. It is a clubhouse for dictators to display their legitimacy in front of their own people and in front of the rest of the world. And America loses votes there by 192 to 1 on a regular basis. That tells you an awful lot about what the United Nations is now like, as does the fact that China now has people in positions of leadership and significant power in almost every United Nations agency. That is a place that is more dangerous than most people realize as well. It joins in with the way that the Chinese have corrupted the education system in America, the way that they've corrupted so much of the world leadership by going around with their Belt and Road initiatives, which are basically sort of Ponzi schemes and blackmail schemes and cheap loans to dictators.
Those who have watched The Man in the High Castle, I find it a bit ironic that on the spot of where the United Nations stands, the Greater Reich built its building in Manhattan. So just saying, I don't know if that means anything, but those who created Man in the High Castle actually used that spot in Manhattan where the UN is to build the Reich's big building in America. Just saying.
Sure.
Also, it's 2022, the year Soylent Green actually takes place.
Yeah.
There we go. Hey,
Soylent Green
is people.
We saw a lot of Soylent Grin on social media over the years. That would be soy face, but it's a different story. Let's go to the home front, though, because the midterms are coming up. And before we sign off, we should address some of the big issues that we're going to be discussing all year. Politicians are going to be fighting over. It's going to be a nice, very interesting game of chess and football combined, an outlook for the midterm season. First, let's talk about two big ones. Education. This year, parents and leaders need to take action on what they've been challenging at meetings and via social media, like the infusion of critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and Proud Marxist pushing their agenda on their kids, as well as quite a bit of Second Amendment issues being the central point of the upcoming midterms. What are your thoughts on these and how they're going to come into play?
All the more important reason for people to get involved at the most local level of government. And I'm seeing, at least even just in my community here, I'm seeing some of the most bold, inspired, just earnest individuals go to school board meetings, speak their minds, and push back against, ultimately, I think that the umbrella of what's going on is this category as to whether the government has the right to decide what a child thinks or what a child hears or learns versus the parent and the individual. And so it's, those lines have already fallen. It's us versus them. It's individuals versus government. All the more reason to get involved there.
Do you guys think we've reached a tipping point in terms of school no longer being regarded as a babysitting service, but people actually starting to realize that what their children are taught matters?
Well, not yet, but we're moving in that direction for sure. And I think it's very important, wherever your school board is, that they have to allow video, because the videos that come out from school boards really activate the whole country. Very helpful thing.
Yeah. Well, I think that the curriculum is something that people, as you point out, did not pay a lot of attention to. But I see in many places, like, is it Washington State, where the governors removed mathematics and other hard things because, we don't want to, it's too difficult for minorities. Talk about racism. It's like, that's racist. You're removing hard content because you don't think the minorities can do it? That's racist. And the idea should be is that we equally apply basic concepts of skills, math, reading. I would argue civics and history need to be emphasized. These are things which we need to be pushing back into the system, and then higher education. I don't know how closely you guys follow it, but the reason we have so much student debt is because the government, who took over all the student loans, has pushed on to these people the idea that you should have a college degree, no matter if it's in basket weaving, which makes no sense. Like, you're going to end up working as the stock manager at the local Giant or what's another store, Walmart, with a degree like that, because it's not going to give you any skills that give you any ability to grow. So the whole education system is something we should pay attention to. And I think I don't know why we haven't. Bryan, maybe you can answer it, because I think
Tony, there's a fundamental question there that you've raised. Why is the government subsidizing education? Why is the government involved in education?
They shouldn't be.
Is it anything that's a local issue and is up to the local community and parents to decide? Surely it's education.
Right.
Well, it's because the product of big government is to continuously try to centralize decision-making at the top, to remove decisions from citizens and centralize it at the top. That can be for nefarious reasons. That can be for, what people in government believe are good reasons. But we better continuously keep guard, because we're the only thing that stands between the nefarious and the good when it comes to decision-making at the top. And thus, the more decisions that we can continue to hold, as we have emphasized in our Constitution, the more decisions that we can hold as citizens in our hands and continue to make ourselves as parents, as neighbors, as community members, as individuals, the safer our society is going to be in perpetuity.
Well, Florida and Texas have been really leaders in figuring out ways to get some of the power out of the hands of the college institution, political people. Just off the top of my head, one of the things that Rick Scott did when he was governor is he created a system where the college gets more money if more of their students get jobs. So he forced the colleges to get involved, and the colleges actually are motivated to steer students towards fields that produce jobs, because the college gets more money if they produce more jobs.
Stepping back, why is he using taxpayer money to drive? Okay, money drives, it provides an incentive to change behaviors, fair enough. But why is there taxpayer money going to colleges and schools at all? I'm sorry, why should those who don't have children have to pay for the education of children? Because it benefits society as a whole? Okay, maybe there's some element of truth to that, and maybe a small element of tax for everybody. But surely it is the parents' responsibility to educate the children.
Well,
that is the primary one.
That's true. But in Florida, for example, since we're doing Florida, there's a lot of money gets paid into the government as prepaid tuition by the citizenry. That's not even taxes. That's people prepaying for the rights to educate their kids in the state universities. So right. He's not even actually taxing money to put into the university. He's just directing the people's own money and to try to get more bang for the buck. So the Florida universities and Texas in other ways, they influencing when Governor Perry was involved in Texas. They're forcing the colleges to be more focused on getting people actual skills that are marketable. And just that itself is something that takes a lot of the political edge off the collegiate teaching. Because if you got to spend your time getting people skills for work, you can't spend your time, turning them on to radical commies.
That's part of the problem. I think they've lost track of being able to actually create students who think critically, as well as give them skills. I mean, I look back on my 4 years in college with a great deal of fondness and a lot of hangovers. But with that said, I actually was on a national championship team. I actually was a member, I'm very proud of this, of the national mock trial team in 1986, where we went to Des Moines, Iowa, to Drake University, Drake Law School, and we beat, in front of the Iowa Supreme Court, Northwestern University. I'm very proud of that, because despite the fact I didn't become a lawyer, unlike others on this call, which I respect, I got to play one in front of the Iowa Supreme Court, and we won against Northwestern. So I'd like to believe those skills that I developed pretending to be a lawyer, having to go through and understand the law, understand how to put together a case, argue the case, actually have to do everything you do, gave me a skill set which I can still use today. But as you all know, I can argue with the best of them, and I actually attribute a lot of that skill to my early training in pre-law and going to that. So, but that, I don't know if you have that level of education available to kids today, because, again, that's a skill set that it served me well, and I still reflect on it very well.
On a humorous note, does that skill help you in marriage, or is that a problem?
Well, I don't think anything in the way of arguing skills helps you in marriage. I think it's just a matter of understanding how to mitigate damage.
On this topic, though, I think since we are talking about just the domestic political landscape in front of us and these midterm elections, one important thing that I think people need to be prepared to do is to vet candidates and vet the policies that they propose.
Yeah.
And I think if you're trying to think through how do we better the education system, we're not advocating that everybody take their children out of public schools and homeschool them. That might be right for some people if they're equipped to do it, if they have the time to do it and the resources to it. But if not, then look for policies that return simply competition to the education market and choice to the parent. Without too many details being known, I think if everybody pays a certain amount to their local or state government in taxes for education for a child, that money should be usable in a voucher style format to be able to utilize towards whatever education the parent feels is right for the child. And private schools, magnet schools, charter schools, all of these come into play here, and ensuring that education continue to meet the standards that are produced through competition.
And to that point, at that point real quick, Tim, look, both the minorities who do not have the ability to afford great schools are able to afford great schools by what Bryan just said. This is where I don't understand how the left, well, I do understand it. I don't understand how any conscientious progressive who really believes that they want to empower people that will not support school choice. I know why, but I'm just saying, but if they followed their rhetoric, they would be all for getting people the money to do that. So
absolutely. I would also add that getting involved can also include looking at the local school budget, seeing how much money is invested in the education of the children in your local area and what results it's achieving. Because, you want to spend your money wisely. I happen to live in an area where the local school does very well, and I pay quite a lot of thousands of dollars each year into it. And what I see coming out is not impressive. There are, this is one of the most expensive school districts in the country in terms of the amount that per head they spend on educating the children here. And yet, very few of those children go on to, should we say, exceptional higher education.
Well, it would be a great organization. I mean, none of us have the time to do it, but maybe someone will be inspired. But if you can create an organization that gets successful people who to go back to the school boards, to all volunteer to go back to speak to their school boards and tell them to what extent things in the school help them succeed and to what extent they hamper them from succeeding. I think that would be very helpful, because basically when people succeed, they just disappear into the horizon. And we're all sitting here talking philosophy of how to take care of the kids in 7th grade. But how about the kids who graduated here 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago? Let's track those people and bring them into the game.
Well, the right school board people have to be able to be there, because you have people who, on these school boards, who will disregard what the professionals or the successful people that you're saying should be speaking in front of these boards have to say. What happens now, and I believe the whole point of what's been happening in the last couple of years, is that parents need to be a little more active. They need to vote in their school board elections and not just nonchalantly say, hey, we don't need to worry about this. The same people will be in every year. Now you know what's happening when you do that. At this point, it's time to take some action. We had on earlier, well, I should say in 2021, we had on Alicia Legg, who was running for school board in Florida for that same reason. She was unhappy with what's going on, so she stands up and says, I want to run for school board. More parents are doing that. And only then will board members, or at least enough board members, listen to those successful people that you want to bring in, Jay. But then that would be a great idea.
That's where the point about are we reaching tipping points matters. This is not something that there is a clear-cut, bang, there's the solution. I'm not proposing that, we instantly stop paying into schools or universities, but I am suggesting that it needs changing, and it needs changing by degrees, and having parents more involved at the local school level and at the university level. Again, universities are not run by, how should I put it? They have boards of directors as well. And if you want to influence something, maybe you should consider, how do I get onto the board of directors of a university, for example, so that you can change the direction that these things are taking. And just by parents being involved in cutting out the very worst of the curriculum abuse that's going on at the moment will make a difference over time.
2021 was also the year of self-defense. We actually had some victories in that department, and that's going to come into play as far as Second Amendment arguments in 2022. We're going to expand on this in a future Thought to Action episode, but Tim Wilson, since you're the head of our Second Amendment project at the London Center, give us a quick overview of what some of the most important issues that will be affecting, as far as the Second Amendment is concerned, that will be affecting the 2022 midterms.
The single most important event will be the Supreme Court decision on a case known as New York Rifle and Pistol Association versus Brule, which is about the way that New York City in particular restricts permitting, but New York State does as well, restricts permitting of law-abiding citizens and their right to buy and carry guns. That is going to be a huge decision. It's going to matter a lot. It will have repercussions that echo around the country. In the background to which is the current administration's push to blame a lot of the violence, the rising violence of the last few years, onto guns, not recognizing that guns are a tool and it's the people that use them that are the problem. At the same time, the general public has recognized that usefulness of those tools by purchasing millions and millions and millions more guns, so that America has become an even more heavily armed society than it was a few years ago. That push continues. These are law-abiding citizens. They are not causing problems with their gun ownership. The problems are all very limited to areas which tend to be very strict on gun control. So that Supreme Court decision is going to have repercussions that go on for decades. It'll be vital to see where it goes.
Well, I should just point out that 2022 is the last year in a long time that has 3 twos in it. So it'd be a good time to make a logo for the Second Amendment.
And we should do a Ouija board reading, too, to find out how the Supreme Court case is going to come out as well. I think it's something we should definitely do.
Well, people always accuse me of moving that little glass thing, or the plastic thing with the glass and metal. That's probably what's going to happen again. On that note, thank you for being with us for this edition of Thought to Action, presented by the Herb London Center for Policy Research. Please remember to hit that like button. Feel free to comment on our discussion. We appreciate your thoughts, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to our Thought to Action channel and pound the big red bell for updates and future shows. Find more about the London Center on our website, londoncenter.org. And if you continue to want to help us create discussions and more programming like this, please join us on Patreon, patreon.com/thoughttoaction. You can enjoy sneak previews, special exclusive content, and our Ask Us Anything sessions. And you can help us greatly by sharing this video with your friends, your colleagues, and social networks. For our panel at the Herb London Center for Policy Research, I'm Chris Cordani. Thank you, stay informed, and make your day a great one.